Welcome back to our final tutorial for the course. This is on building a logical framework or a log frame. So in this short tutorial, we'll review some of the basics of a logical framework, a log frame, the concepts behind the log frame, and then we'll look at some examples, and we'll use the examples that we've been using throughout the course from our fictional land of Keithtopia. So let's move on to the next slide here. You've seen this diagram in the introductory video for the course, for this module, but also in the self-guided module itself. And this is the basic structure of a logical framework. On the on the left-hand side here, you can see we start off with our inputs. And the inputs are the things that you need to run your project. They're like the fuel for the project, the raw materials, the building blocks. And this is things like money. It could be a venue if you're having a workshop or a meeting or something like that. If you need technical expertise, it could be a consultant, a technical specialist, things like that. It's all the basic pieces that you need. And with those basic pieces, you put them together and you do things for your project. So the inputs are the basic resources, and if you have those, you can make your project go. Now, an important thing about the inputs at the concept note stage is that, well, we have to have a general idea of what the inputs will be, because that helps us to describe the budget for the concept note. But overall, we do not have to precisely know what the inputs for the project are going to be, because that will be determined during your full proposal stage, when you're developing your full proposal, your detailed design stage. And a lot of what goes into the inputs will come out of the feasibility study. So at this stage, you have to have a general idea of the types of things that you need, but you don't have to be precise about it. You don't have to make a list of all the things that you will need, like a shopping list. You'll do that later on in the more detailed design stage, but that's after your concept note has been approved. But if you have your inputs here, as you can see my pointer, if you have your inputs, then you can do activities. And activities are just like they sound. These are the actions that your project takes. These are the actions that the project does to make use of the inputs. And this is things like conduct a workshop, or to conduct a survey or study, formulate a report, things like that. When you talk about activities, they usually have a verb in them. They usually have a verb, an action word. So when you do your activities, you produce something with your activities. You produce a good or service. And that's what the outputs are. So the outputs are the goods and services that your project provides. I find, in my experience, it's very useful and handy to think of outputs as goods and services, because this helps me it avoids confusion. It helps me to distinguish between the outputs and the outcomes. And we'll talk about the outcomes in just a minute. But remember, the outputs are the goods and services that you will produce from your project. Then we move on. If you produce your outputs, then you will have outcomes. These are the changes that occur as a result of the project outputs. So remember the difference here. An output is a good or service that you provide, but the outcome is change that results from providing that good or service. That's the difference between the output and an outcome. Now, in everyday language, you may use the term output and outcome interchangeably. They mean almost the same thing in everyday language. But remember that designing a project is a technical task. And just like all other technical tasks, we have specialized vocabulary to refer to parts of that technical task. And so when we put on our project developer hat, like we mentioned in the self-guided presentation, when we decide that we're taking on the role of a project designer, then we have to be very careful about the way that we use these words. We have to use them in a specialized way. They have technical meanings. So when you're outside at the end of the day, when you're no longer working and you're not a project developer anymore, you can use the word output and outcomes to mean the same thing. But when you start to design a project, when you come to work in the morning, then you have to remember that these two words have different meanings, output and outcome. They cannot be interchanged. And so often there's confusion about the difference between the output and the outcome because they seem similar. They seem similar. And even experienced project designers can be confused about the meaning of these two terms. But rest assured that the more you practice, the better you will get. So you may be confused at first about the difference between outputs and outcomes. But as you gain experience, it will become clearer to you. Now we'll play a game in a few minutes that should help you master the difference between outputs and outcomes. But let's go back to inputs and make sure that we understand the logic here. So remember, if we have our inputs, if we have the raw materials for the project, then we can do activities, right? If we have money, if we have resources, then we can do actions. We can do activities. And if we're able to do these activities, we're going to produce some goods and services. We're going to produce some goods and services. And then if we produce the goods and services, well, people will benefit, and there will be some positive changes in the community or in the country or in the sector that we're working in. So that's the logic behind the logical framework. The inputs go to the activities go to the outputs, and then the outcomes. Now finally, over here on the far right, we have our impact. And impact is similar to outcomes, but it's slightly different. And that impacts are, as you can see here, the longer term changes that occur as a result of project outcomes. So these are the bigger changes in society that your project is contributing to. Now I usually like to draw a line right about here between outcomes and impacts. I usually draw a line here because what that line means, and you can see I'm making an imaginary line with my pointer. What that line means is that there's these things over here with your outcomes, outputs, activities, and inputs. Those are the things that your project will control and that your project is accountable for. So at the end of the project, you need to achieve your outcomes. You need to do that. But impacts, on the other hand, are broader changes like poverty reduction, rural poverty reduction, things like that, ending childhood hunger. These are the types of things that are bigger than one single project. And so your project alone by itself cannot be expected to achieve the impact, but it will contribute to the impact. It will move your community or your country in the direction of that impact. So just to be clear here, the outcomes are the things that you're taking responsibility for. So when you set your outcomes, make sure that you're ambitious but realistic. And the impacts, these are the broader changes in society that your outcomes will contribute to. So now let's move on and let's look at some examples. So our inputs here, like we said, these are the resources that you'll need for your project, and that's money and labor and materials and things like that. It's fairly straightforward. And at the concept note stage, again, we do not have to have an exact accounting of these things. And then we move on to activities, and the activities are those are the actions taken in the project that will make use of the inputs. Some examples: conduct a training, draft a bill, create educational materials, and things like that. Now, remember, we're thinking in terms of a SAP project, a Simplified Approval Process project. And so that has to be a category C with minimal environmental and social risks. And so for the most part with a SAP project, you're not going to build anything. But if you are doing a larger project that is not a SAP project, that is a category B project or a category A project, construction works may be activities as well. But we did not put them in our list because we're focusing on SAP projects. Now, another thing I'd like you to notice here is that this is my personal practice, and not everybody agrees with me, but this is a way that Keith does things. So when I'm talking about regulations or laws, if that's one of my activities to create new legislation, to create new regulation, I will never ever write in a project, pass a bill or pass a regulation, pass a law. I always will put draft bill or draft regulation or draft whatever. And the reason that I do that is because, remember, at the end of my project, I have to have done these activities. And I can guarantee, when I'm running a project, I can guarantee that I will draft a bill or I will draft regulations. But if I say pass a bill, or excuse me, pass a law or pass regulations, see, that involves some political processes that are beyond the control of my project. And so it's very possible that even though I draft very good regulations, they may not be adopted by the Ministry of Agriculture or the Ministry of Fisheries or the Ministry of Space Exploration or whatever the case may be. And that, so if that will cause my activity to fail if I have written pass regulations or pass law. And that's not my fault. It's not the fault of my implementation team. It's because of circumstances that we cannot control. And so for me, my personal preference, the way that I do things is if I'm doing regulations or laws or anything legal, I'll always have my activity and my output to be draft instead of a law or regulation being passed. But then once we have our activities, like we said, if we do these things, we're going to produce some goods and services. Yeah. So these are the products or services that come from the project activities. And this is things like a farmers group is established, a bill is drafted, like I said a few minutes ago, education materials are available. Yeah, education materials are produced, a curriculum is available. And remember, these are all products. So farmers group established. The product in this case is a farmers group. This is something that's new that we've created that was not there. A bill drafted. The bill is our product. It's our good. It's not a good like you go into a store and buy, but it's more generally speaking, it's a good. It's a product. Educational materials are available. That's clearly a good. That's clearly a good. Or in some cases, if my Department of Agriculture has improved capabilities for climate smart agriculture, that is a service that I provided, right? I have provided that service to the Department of Agriculture. Now then, if we develop these goods and services, then we will have outcomes. These are the changes that occur as a result of the project outputs. So, for example, farming communities are more resilient to climate change, or the community is more aware of climate change. See, these are changes. These are not goods and services that have been produced. And lastly, we have our impacts. This is the longer-term changes that occur as a result of the project outcomes. And you have food production is increased by 5%, the quality of life is improved, rural livelihoods are improved, things like that. Now, in most cases, so food production is increased by 5%, for example. See, that's a strategic goal. That's the type of thing that you would find in a 5-year plan for the Ministry of Agriculture or for the medium-term development plan for the country. These are big goals, and usually it takes more than one project to achieve these goals. It takes some policies, it takes work on from non-government stakeholders and so forth. Usually it's not one project that is going to achieve that impact, and so that's why it's an impact. Your project will contribute to the impact, but it will not achieve the impact all on its own. So with those things in mind, let's play a game. This slide is based on a slide that was given to me by a colleague at UNDP, Yusuke Taishi. So I have to thank him and give him a shout out for this slide, this game that we're about to play. But what we're going to do here, across the top, we have inputs, activities, outputs, outcomes, and impacts. And as we go through each of these statements, you're going to choose which of these categories the statement applies to. Yeah. And at the end, you can keep your own score, and at the end we will have a prize. We'll have a prize for the winner. So let's start. Sector-specific expertise and disaster preparedness developed. Is that an input? Is it an activity? Is it an output? Is it an outcome, or is it an impact? Sector-specific expertise in disaster preparedness developed. Now, we know it's not an input because it's not raw material. It's not money. It's not supplies. It kind of sounds like an activity, but usually activities begin with an action word. It's trainings and things like this. So this is something that is a little bit bigger than an activity. You would conduct several activities to achieve this goal, to achieve this. Is it an output? It could be an output. It could be an outcome. It's probably not an impact because it's not a broader change in society. So let's see what the answer is. And the answer is output. Now this first one is a difficult one, and we put the difficult one up front on purpose. Some people may have said that this is an outcome. And the reason that I say it's not an outcome is because it does not refer to a change in a ministry or an agency or people or behavior or anything like that. It just is that we have developed expertise in disaster preparedness. We've developed the expertise. We've provided a service. We've created a new expertise. Now, it does not say that that expertise has been utilized. If this was a utilization of that expertise, for example, disaster preparedness improved, disaster preparedness practices improved, or something like that, that represents a change in behavior. But in this case, we're just providing a new capability. Whether or not that capability is used remains to be seen. So let's look at the next one. Income of low-income families increased. This is a big task. It's probably not an input. Yeah, there's an action in here, right, to increase, but this is not a specific action that I can point to. I can't see somebody actually doing this. This is a result of many actions. Yeah. To increase income. There's not one single action that you can do to increase incomes. There's not a realistic action anyway. So let's see. It's not an input. It's not an activity. Is it an output? It seems like it's bigger than an output. So that leaves us with outcome or impact. Let's see what the answer is. The outcome, it's an outcome here. And I will say that this, in many cases, this could actually be an impact as well. It depends on the size of your project. Yeah, if you're doing a relatively small project, it may not have the scope to improve the income of low-income families. So if you're doing a smaller project, it may contribute to this in the longer term, but the project itself might not do it. And so in that case, it would be an impact. But if you're doing a large project that is 5 years or 6 years or 7 years, it may be realistic to expect that you can improve the income of low-income families in that time period. All right, train community members in bookkeeping. Teach small and medium-sized enterprises at the community level how to do accounting so that they can do better business. This is an entrepreneurship training type of thing. And we want to do this we want to train women and men community farmers. We want to make sure that it's a gender equitable thing that we're doing here. So is this an input? It's not an input because it's not raw materials. Is it an impact? This is not an impact because it's not a big picture consideration. So that leaves us with outcome, output, activity. So the key thing here is that you've got an action word here at the beginning, train. Train community members or conduct a training. And that is definitely an activity. That makes it an activity. Now let's look at the next one. Undertake a value chain assessment. This is not an input. We would need maybe an expert to do that. We would need a consultant to undertake the value chain assessment, an economist. That would be our input. But this is undertake. There's an action word there. Or conduct a value chain assessment. And that's the giveaway there. Conduct or undertake a value chain assessment is the activity. And you can think of the output that that this would contribute to. Maybe we're linking buyers and sellers of a certain commodity together. That could be the output. Yeah. Capacities created within Ministry of Agriculture, Forestry, and Fisheries to deliver climate resilient extension support. Now, this clearly is not an input, and it does not start off with a action word. This capacity is created. So this is a result of something. Capacity is created. So this is not an activity, but rather this would be the result of several activities. Maybe a training workshop or several training workshops. It could be another activity would be we develop guidance materials or capacity development materials and so forth. We have roundtables. These are things that would contribute to this, but this is more of a result. It's not an impact because it's not a big picture thing, and it's not an outcome because there's been no change in behavior at this point. So this is clearly an output. Because remember, this is a good or service. We've provided a service, and that service is to improve capacity within the ministry. Now we could potentially turn this into an outcome. And the outcome would be something like Ministry of Agriculture, Forestry, and Fisheries offers climate resilient extension support, or something like that. This is a change in the behavior of the organization. It's how they use the capacity. The way that they use the capacity, the way that they use the output, that would be the outcome. So let's look at the next one. New businesses and jobs are created in targeted poor, rural, and urban areas. So this is not an input, it's not an activity, because there's many activities that would go into this. So it's not an activity. Is it an output? New businesses and jobs are created. It could potentially be an output, but this seems to be bigger than an output. This is a change in the economy. This is a change in economic conditions. So that means it's either an outcome or an impact. So again, the answer to this probably depends on the size of your project. We're going to say that this is an outcome. An outcome. And that's because we're assuming that this is a large project. Next, national and local policies and plans are made responsive to gender issues. Not an input. It's not an activity because it doesn't start off, there's not a specific thing that we can see. There's not an action that we can see. This is a result, clearly. So it's either an output, outcome, or impact. So national and local policies and plans are made responsive to gender issues. So that means that the policy and planning framework has been changed in this country. So there's a change. The policies and plans are now incorporating gender issues. That's something new that was not happening before. So that means it's an outcome. It's not an output. It's not a good or service. There are a number of goods or services that would contribute to this, right? Improved capacities for gender inclusive planning or something like that. That would be an outcome, an output that would contribute to this. So this is clearly an outcome. Rural poverty incidences reduced by 5%. So 5% reduction in rural poverty. That's definitely not an input. It's not an activity. It's not an output. This is a big picture thing. The only question is whether that's an outcome or an impact. And for me, I will say that this is an impact because this is a strategic development goal. Usually this is something that you may see in a 5-year plan for a government or for a Ministry of Rural Development or something like that. And again, it's not, in most cases, this is not something that one project can do by itself. It's unless it's in a small village or in a small area. But in this case, we're going to say it's an impact. And then we've got, whoops, I gave away the answer on this one already. This is a confusing one, but we threw the answer up. Low-income families acquire the skills necessary to sustain resilient home gardening practices. So I would call this one output because they acquire the skills. It doesn't say that they're using them. But in some cases, you may see this also as an outcome, this type of thing. So either or, this is where outcome versus output becomes confusing. My preference would be output, but if you said outcome, we'll give you a point for that as well. Next, we have policy and regulatory environment improved for weather index-based insurance provision. So this is index insurance, and that's a good innovation for climate change adaptation. But in most places, it requires some regulatory changes, some rules to be put in place. It needs an enabling environment. You can't just start offering index insurance, because insurance industries are regulated in virtually every country. And so you need to do some groundwork, some preparatory things. Now, this is not an activity. This is a result. And this is an important result. So it's either an output, outcome, or impact. It's not an impact because it's not a huge, it's not a big picture thing. The impact that would result from this is a reduction in losses due to climate events or something like that. A big longer term vision type of thing. But this says policy and regulatory environment improved. So that's the giveaway on this one. The regulatory environment is improved. The conditions are changed in the country. And by doing this, by improving the policy and regulatory the policy and regulatory conditions, the environment for that, then what we're doing is we're making it easier for private sector actors to enter into this field, to start to offer weather index-based insurance provisions. So this is an outcome. This is a change in enabling conditions. We've got a new building code with climate risks integrated as drafted. Here, see, that's me drafting. I don't pass the regulatory code. I don't pass the building code because that's a political process. So this is not an input, and it's not an impact. The impact would be resilience improved or something like that. So it's either an output or an outcome. Now, I will say that this is an output, because as we all know, just because there are codes in place, that does not mean that the behavior has changed. Many places, and you're probably familiar with places where there's good codes, there's good regulations, but the behavior has not necessarily changed because of poor enforcement, lack of awareness, and other things like that. So the building code is an output. Now, if we combine that with other outputs, like a outreach campaign, a stakeholder awareness raising campaign, something like that, and it leads to an actual behavior change in the way that people are building buildings, then that's the outcome. That's the ultimate change that we want to see. And then lastly, money is provided to purchase building materials. This is very clearly an input. So tally up your score and send it in, and we'll calculate up the scores from everybody that played the game. And if you are the winner, we will notify you shortly. All right, next, let's run through a quick example. This is our first example. We'll do 2 examples total. And our first example is about climate-smart agriculture in Keitopia. When we talked about how, in an earlier module, we talked about how Keitopia has is very reliant on agriculture, the agriculture sector, and that the agriculture sector in Keitopia is one of the most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. And as a small island developing state, Keitopia is among the most vulnerable countries in the world, and agriculture is in particularly vulnerable. So with respect to the GCF, remember the impact potential that we talked about in a previous module, the agriculture sector is a very important one for Keitopia in terms of climate vulnerability. We also know that from reviewing Keitopia's policy documents, that the agriculture sector is a priority sector for climate change adaptation. So we're going to do a climate smart agriculture project because that's in the NAP. That's in Keitopia's National Adaptation Plan, is to do climate smart agriculture. And we've already done a problem tree, we've done an objective tree, and we've done a theory of change. And so we're ready to design the activities that respond to that theory of change. So our objective is going to be the Keitopia's agriculture sector is made resilient to the impacts of climate change. That's our overall objective. That's what we want that's the goal of the project. So we'll simplify this. We're going to make a simple project for the sake of expediency here. Now, for this objective, the first thing that I want to do is I want to figure out what outcomes are needed. What big changes, what changes in institutional or human behavior do I need to bring about with my project? And so those are going to be my outcomes. And I know from my problem tree and my theory of change that the two things that I need are, I need for farmers to adopt climate smart agriculture practices. See, that's a behavior change. We need for the farmers to start using these new techniques, changing their behavior. And notice we've made this women and men farmers. In Keytopia, it just so happens that both men and women are farmers. It's about 50%, 50%. So in order to make this a gender-sensitive outcome, we'll make sure to say that women and men farmers are going to benefit equally from this part of the project. So we know that we need to have our farmers adopt these climate smart agriculture practices. And another thing that we need to have our financial sector so that it is conducive to the climate smart agriculture, so it supports climate smart agriculture. Because in our barriers analysis, we understood in our problem tree that one of the reasons that we're not adopting new techniques is because our financial sector does not support it. It does not incentivize these new techniques. So I've got my two outcomes, and in a real life project you may have additional outcomes, but we only have one slide here, so we're only doing two outcomes. So women and men farmers adopt climate smart agriculture practices and enabling financial conditions to promote climate smart agriculture established. These are the two big changes that I want to bring about to make my objective happen. And so the next thing is to think about what are the products, what are the goods and services that I need to provide. And here the first one is I need for the farmers to know about climate smart agriculture. CSA is climate smart agriculture. I need for them to know about the techniques, and I need for them to have access to those techniques. So that's one thing I need. Now remember, this is a good or service that I'm providing. The actual behavior change is what? Adopting climate smart agriculture practices. That's outcome. But in order for that outcome to happen, the farmers need to know about it, right? And they need to have access to the techniques. What else? We also have the Ministry of Agriculture, the extension services. They need to support climate smart agriculture. That's another thing that I need to provide. The Ministry of Agriculture needs to know how to train farmers or to help farmers and to conduct outreach to farmers. And then down here in outcome 2, what do I need? I need a microcredit and insurance program for climate smart agriculture. We need to establish these things. So those are the products that I'm going to create. And once I have the products outlined, then I can start to think about the activities. So let's start up here at output 1-1. And you notice how these things are numbered. Outcome 1, the first output under outcome 1 is 1-1-1-1. And then the first activity is going to be 1-1-1. Right? Outcome 1, the first output for outcome 1, the first activity for the first output for outcome 1, 1-1-1. That makes it easy to understand how the activities are grouped if you number them like this. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to form gender equitable farmer groups with master farmers. So we'll have these farmers associations for women and men. It says gender equitable. These farmer associations, they're teams basically, and with those teams we'll have one master farmer that's really a champion for climate smart agriculture. And in those groups, those groupings are going to be mutual support groups, and they're going to learn climate smart agriculture together, and they're going to support one another. And they'll also be able to, they can form a cooperative, they can buy supplies together. There's lots of things that they can do if we can form these groups. So, but that's not enough to have knowledge and access to climate-smart agriculture techniques. So we're going to establish a village demonstration plot for climate-smart varieties. So in the middle of the village, we're gonna set up a plot of taro, or cabbages, or whatever it is, or sweet potatoes, or maize, or whatever it is that we grow here, millet, cassava, whatever it is that we grow in this particular village, and we're going to demonstrate in that plot climate-smart varieties and climate-smart mulching and soil conservation techniques and things like that, so that the farmers can easily come and they can see how to do these things. They can see with their own two eyes. They don't have to read anything. They don't have to do anything like that. They don't have to listen to the radio. So this is accessible to everybody, right? Even if they have problems reading, if they don't have access to electricity, if they don't have the internet or a smartphone, they can come out and they can see this demonstration plot. So this is very accessible. And then we've got activity 113. See how this is numbered? The third activity. Conduct a farmer field school training. Now we know from experience that farmer field schools are very effective. They work all over the world. So let's test our logic here. If we form farmers groups with master farmers, and if we establish village demonstration plots for climate smart varieties, and if we conduct farmer field school trainings, well, is it reasonable to assume that then farmers will have knowledge and access to climate-smart agriculture techniques? And I think that the answer to that question is yes. So we've simplified this quite a bit. You could add more activities if you need them. Typically, an output has between 2 to 7 activities. But because we only have one slide, we only have 3 activities. So let's look at the next one down here, our second output, 1.2. Ministry of Agriculture Extension Services support climate smart agriculture. That's the output that we want. So the first activity, notice how this is labeled, 1, 2, 1. Output 1, 2. Activity 1, 2, first activity. 1, 2, 1. So we're going to develop curriculum materials and reference materials for farmers. Yeah. And so these are materials that the Extension Service officers can use to train farmers and to disseminate to farmers the reference materials. It could be a guidebook, it could be a picture book, it could be whatever is appropriate locally. That's what we're going to do. And then our second activity is we develop these materials here and the reference materials, but in our second activity we're going to train our extension officers to know how to use these things. Yeah. So we develop the materials and then we train the extension officers on how to apply the materials. So we can test our logic here too. If we conduct training workshops for extension officers and if we develop curriculum materials and reference materials for farmers, is it reasonable to say that the Ministry of Agriculture Extension Services will support climate smart agriculture? And I think that that's reasonable. Yes, it's true. Now we may add more activities in a real project, but I think you get the idea. Now let's go down here to output 2.1. Microcredit and insurance programs for climate smart agriculture established. And we need an activity. Number 1, activity 211. You see outcome 2. I'll put 2.1. Activity 2.1, the first activity. Conduct financial analysis to determine capitalization requirements and loan sizes for revolving fund. Right? So you need to do some technical tasks to set up a microcredit and insurance program. Now, and those technical tasks are the activities. Typically, you would hire a consultant to do those things. So that's our first activity here. Our second activity is develop a payment app for a smartphone, but also village service points for points of contact for clients. So if you have a smartphone, you can use our app to make your payment or to withdraw money or whatever it is you want to do. And if you don't have a smartphone, you can go visit the point of contact in the village. So it's accessible to everybody. All right, so that's our very basic climate smart agriculture project. Now on the next slide, we're going to look at a second example. And in this second example, you'll see how we move from the objective tree to the logical framework. Now we're going to look at our second example. And this example goes back to the example that we've been using in the previous modules as well. And this is about Keytopia and sea level rise. Now, if you remember in our problem tree exercise, we looked at the problem of sea level rise and coastal settlements in Keytopia not being resilient or being damaged by sea level rise, the impacts of sea level rise. And we worked through a problem tree, and then after we did the problem tree, we developed an objective tree. And the objective tree, remember, is the ideal situation, the alternative future, the better future that we want to bring about through our project. And we use the problem tree and we use the objective tree together to develop our theory of change. And the theory of change describes the process of change that your project is going to make happen. And remember, we said this is why your project is going to work. Your project is going to work because you have objectives that respond directly to the problems that you've identified and the direct and indirect drivers of the problem. So as you see on this slide, we're going back to the objective tree that we used in previous examples. Now this is extremely important because a key thing about the log frame is that it always needs to be linked to the theory of change. And this is why we do the log frame last in this workshop. And like I said in the first module, in module number 1, you may recall that I said, well, we do things differently. We do the log frame last. And we do it differently from some project teams that rush to put the log frame together. And when they do this, it's not based on a rigorous exploration of the problem. It does not have a good connection to the theory of change. But in this case, because we've already done our problem tree and our objective tree, we have a very good connection to our theory of change. And as you will see as we go through this process here, you will see that once you have developed a good theory of change, it makes the log frame development much, much easier. So again, let's go back to our objective tree, and you can see it on this slide. And the objective was that coastal communities would be more resilient to the effects of sea level rise. And we have the 3 key elements here. People build in safe areas. Remember, before, people in the problem situation, people are building in areas that are vulnerable to sea level rise and coastal erosion and so forth. That was part of the problem. Structures were not resilient, so with our project we want to make sure that structures are resilient to climate change. And then we have more healthy mangroves and coral. Remember that part of our problem, part of the lack of resilience of the coastal communities, was that mangroves and corals were being degraded, were being damaged, were being mismanaged. And so this is our improved situation that we want to bring about with our project. So the next step is to translate this, to turn this into a logical framework, into a procedure that helps us to bring this ideal future or this alternative state into being in reality. So let's talk through how we're going to do this. So we're going to move from the objective tree to the logical framework. And all of the information, remember, this is the trunk of our tree. And these were the roots of our tree down here. These are the big roots, and these are the deeper roots, right? So we're going to focus on these roots to move from objective tree to logical framework. So we'll use the objective tree to determine the project's objective, the outcomes, and the outputs. And you can see that these are color-coded. That's for a reason. So the objective of the project comes from the objective of the objective tree. That's why we call it the objective tree. Coastal communities are more resilient to the effects of sea level rise. That will be the objective of our project. And then our outcomes, remember the outcomes are the broader changes that you want to bring about with your projects. Changes in the way that people behave, or that systems operate, or that institutions behave, right? So these are changes that we want to bring about, and these are in green. So we want for people to build in safe areas. Now remember, before they were building in unsafe areas, so they were building in vulnerable areas. So if we can convince them somehow to build in safe areas, that's a big change that the project has achieved. Also, another behavior change is that structures are more resilient because people are building them to be more resilient. Before in the problem state, we were suffering damage from sea level rise because the structures were not resilient. They weren't built to be resilient. So if we can get people and enterprises and so forth and to build their structures so that they're more resilient, then that's a change. That's a change in behavior. And then we've got healthy mangroves and coral as opposed to degraded mangroves and coral. That's a change in conditions, a change in environmental conditions, but it would also represent a change in management behavior or the way that people manage their resources. So all of these things are very clearly outcomes, and these are going to become the components of my project. So remember, with outcomes, you want change. You don't want your outcomes to simply be things that you produce, goods and services. Those are the outputs, right? So the outputs, these come from our indirect enabling conditions that we laid out in our objective tree. So very clearly, we can see how the roots of our objective tree contribute to the logical framework. And this helps us to make sure that everything in our logical framework is rooted in our theory of change. Now, can you imagine trying to do a logical framework without having an objective tree? So the objective tree tells you exactly what to put in your logical framework. Without the objective tree, you just have to make everything up for your logical framework. And that's what a lot of people do. But they end up having their projects rejected because they do that, because the logical framework is not rooted in a theory of change. So let's look at this in a different way. Let's simplify it and organize it differently. So now you'll see everything is going to move around. And so we're going to write this up now as if it were a logical framework. And what we've done, we have taken pieces from our objective tree, and we're going to rearrange these so that they are a logical framework. So the first thing is up here at the top, our coastal communities are more resilient to the effects of sea level rise. And see, this is our objective. Now we're going to put our objectives up here. And just like our first example, the climate smart agriculture example, we put our outcomes up first. And you can see our outcomes here. Number one, new housing and commercial construction is located out of vulnerable areas. So this outcome is very similar to people build in safe areas. Sometimes when you translate the objective tree into the log frame, you use more specific and precise language. So people build in safe areas, that means the same thing as our first outcome. New housing and commercial construction is located out of vulnerable areas. And in our second outcome, it corresponds to structures are more resilient. So our outcome is structures in Keytopia are more resilient to sea level rise. It's very similar, very clearly linked to the objective tree, and therefore linked to the the theory of change. So in addition to our outcomes, remember the outcomes are the broad changes, the changes in behavior that we want to bring about. But those changes in behavior are empowered by goods and services that we provide, and these are the outputs of the project. So we put our outputs next, and our first output here corresponds to the maps. Hazard maps are available, and we're going to say that multi-hazard maps are produced for Keytopia's urban coastal areas. And when we say multi-hazard maps, well, it's not just sea level rise, but it might also be for coastal flooding from heavy rains and things like that. It could be for heat waves, it could be for droughts, and it could be for other hazards. It could be for landslides, for many, many different hazards, whatever we're experiencing. But we'll use multi-hazards because we want people to be resilient to all of the hazards. So that's one, and you can see that this is a product. Multi-hazard maps, very clearly a product, are produced. They're made available. And then we have zoning code enforcement is improved. Yeah, and here that corresponds to good enforcement. Good enforcement. Zoning code enforcement is improved, so people are building appropriate structures in appropriate places. Now, you probably are familiar with situations where there are zoning regulations, but those zoning regulations are not followed. And in this case, the output is that we're going to improve. The product is that we're improving enforcement. And then down here, blah blah blah. Output 1.3, this corresponds to something else that we may do, right? And it's to show you the numbering. Most of the time outcomes have between 2 and 5 outputs, yeah? So blah blah blah, we will do something else, right? To contribute to this outcome 1 here. Now outcome 2, remember, structures in Keytopia are more resilient to sea level rise. And here we'll make some outputs. We'll have some goods and services that we provide. And the first is that community members gain knowledge of sea level rise and associated hazards. So that's a service that we're providing. We're making people know about sea level rise and associated hazards. That's our first output. And then our second output is community members acquire skills in resilient construction. Again, this is a service we're providing. We're giving people skills. Now, this is not an outcome because they haven't used the skills yet. Yeah, the outcome is what the result of using the output. So if community members use their skills in resilient construction, then structures in Keytopia are more resilient to sea level rise, and that is our outcome. And then our third output is that community members have resources to support resilience building activities. They have resources like money and time and so forth. So all of these things, remember that all of these things should be rooted. They have to be connected to your objective tree. They have to be connected to the theory of change and the problem tree. Otherwise, they should not be in the log frame. The log frame is just listing things. It's a procedure for moving from your problem tree to your objective tree. That's what it is. It's a blueprint. Remember, we said that in the tutorial, and I said that in the introductory presentation for this module. So let's look at the activities. That's what we'll put last. Now remember, these things come from our objective tree. Yeah, multi-hazard maps are produced. Oh, look at this one. Community members gain knowledge of sea level rise and associated hazards. Once I know that that's the output that I have to produce, I can go into my toolkit of experience, and there are probably 100 different activities that I could use to make that happen, to produce that output. I want to use activities that are most appropriate for this community in Keytopia. So you may use different activities in Keytopia, which is a small island developing state, than you might use in the Deccan Plateau in India, for example, or in various locations in sub-Saharan Africa. You might produce the same output, which is increased awareness, but the activities to do that may be different from place to place for different reasons, for cultural reasons, for economic reasons, and so forth. So we just need to identify what the most appropriate activities are for our context. And there are all sorts of best practice guides and manuals that you can refer to for ideas of activities. So activity 111, design and implement technical training on survey techniques. So that's very, 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 very straightforward. We need to design the curriculum for the training, and we need to implement the training. So that's two sub-activities bundled into one activity. But very clearly, that will help us to develop multi-hazard maps. And our second activity because remember, outputs are usually the result of several different activities. So here we have provide technical training on open source hazard map production. Yeah. So for Keytopia, our spatial planning agency, our municipal planning agency has a very, very small budget, and we cannot afford expensive mapping software. And so we know also that our stakeholders don't have access to expensive mapping software. So what we're going to do, we've made a decision that we're going to do everything open source so that it's free. We're using free programs. Many of our people that are working for us, they may be trained in commercial platforms, and they may not know much about the open source platform. So we want to have a technical training on the actual open source platform. Yeah, that way our staff and probably some external stakeholders from non-government organizations or community organizations, faith-based organizations, maybe from the academic community, etc. They can also know how to use this open source software to produce hazard maps. So we have a very transparent and participatory process here. Next, we're going to conduct a survey of coastal villages in Keytopia. Now remember, we've already designed and implemented a training on survey techniques, and here this is where we're going to apply the survey. So we're going to send out teams and actually map out and take measurements in villages in Keytopia. And then lastly, we'll conduct dissemination and training workshops for community stakeholders. I almost said Canadian soldiers, and I don't know why I would say that. It's late where I am. But we're going to conduct a dissemination and training workshop for community stakeholders. That's who that's for. And that's for the maps that we produced through these activities. So let's test our logic here. I always like to test my logic. And what that means is I want to just ask myself, I want to examine my activities and determine if these are enough, these are sufficient for producing the output that I want to produce. So let's just do if statements. If we design and implement a technical training on survey techniques, if we do that, and if we conduct a survey of coastal villages, and if we provide technical training on open source hazard map production, and then if we conduct a dissemination workshop and a training workshop for community members, would that be enough for multi-hazard maps to be produced for Keytopia's urban coastal areas? And I think yes, that would probably be enough. Now you may want to add another activity where the hazard maps are published on paper and also uploaded to an online server, an online a website, or something like that. Or you could even make an app. You could make posters and put those posters up in community halls and community gathering areas and schools and other places that people tend to gather. So those are some additional activities that you could do depending on your circumstances. Let's look at zoning code enforcement here. And again, we didn't put all of these activities because we're limited in space. We only have one slide, but we also are limited in time. We don't want to talk all night long about this. So then output 1.2, what's going on here? The zoning code enforcement is improved. Yeah. So zoning code enforcement is improved. First, we'll have enforcement training for the Bureau of Planning and Permitting. So we're gonna do some human resource work here in the agency that is responsible for planning and permitting, so that they can more efficiently enforce the regulations, the zoning regulations. But at the same time, right, this is a stick approach. This is penalizing people that do not follow the rules, so fining them or punishing them somehow. Now that's one approach, but sometimes that doesn't work in all circumstances. So we also, with our stick approach, we want to have a carrot. Yeah. So I always like to combine enforcement with some sort of incentives or some sort of outreach, awareness raising among the community, so that we don't have to enforce, so that we improve relations with the community. So in activity 122, we establish a community liaison or outreach office, and outreach to improve community understanding for zoning enforcement and so forth. As many people, if they understand why the zoning codes are in place, they will follow the zoning codes. So we use enforcement, but we also use the soft touch, because that's appropriate in Keithopia. Now, in your context, it may not be appropriate. So remember, always do things that use activities that are locally appropriate. So then we've got output 1.3, blah, 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 do some more stuff, right? And the activity is here, do more stuff. And I just put that as placeholders. And then activity 132, do even more stuff. Yeah. Don't put that in your project proposal. Come up with actual outputs and activities. Yeah, these are just placeholders here. I wanted to show how we number things. Yeah. So then let's come down here to outcome 2, and then we've got community members gain knowledge of sea level rise and associated hazards. So what actions are we going to take to produce that output? And the first one is we'll conduct community-oriented workshops for women and men on threats of climate change. Yeah. So this is very important that we make sure that this is inclusive. This is inclusive. We want this to be gender sensitive, because in many contexts it's easy for women or some other groups, maybe sometimes it's based on caste or ethnicity or so forth. It's easy for some groups to be excluded from these processes. Yeah. So communities themselves are not homogeneous. Communities have different groupings and different power structures and so forth, as we all know. So we want to make sure that this activity reaches everybody in the community equitably. And so we're going to say that the workshops are conducted for women and men. And that makes us think about the way that the workshop is set up. So we don't want the workshop to be planned for a time when women have other duties. Maybe if women are responsible for cooking meals at home, or for taking care of the children, or for taking them to school or picking them up from school or things like that. We don't want these community meetings to interfere with those other domestic obligations that people may have, because it will reduce their participation in the community-oriented workshop. So we want to make sure that this workshop is held at a time and in a venue that maximizes participation. Another thing we can do here with workshops is we can make sure that they're accessible to disabled people. Or to people with disabilities, right? So we'll make sure that the venue is accessible, that if it's on a second floor of a building, that it can be accessed by people that may have difficulty going upstairs. We'll want to make sure that there's a accessible bathroom or restroom on the floor where the activity or where the workshop is happening. All of these things. So the community-oriented workshop should be as inclusive as possible. We want to encourage people, as many people as possible, to take part in this, because we want the whole community to gain knowledge of sea level rise. So then what's next? Activity 2.1.2, develop a radio and poster campaign on sea level rise and associated hazards. So that's for Keithopia. People listen to the radio. So we're going to do some short radio spots, 30 seconds a piece, and we'll do a campaign of interesting radio spots that are in the local language, that are in Keithopian, and that are culturally appropriate, right, and that appeal to different stakeholder groups. And these radio spots are going to be on the radio when people are listening to the radio. They won't be on the radio at 3 o'clock in the morning. They'll be when people are listening to the radio. And we'll also have posters, attractive posters. Some for schools, some for the Women's Hall, some for the Fishermen's Union building, different posters for different audiences that help people understand sea level rise, right? So this will be the targeted messaging campaign. Yeah. And that will, so if we do, let's test the logic here. If we develop our messaging campaign, if we develop radio and poster campaign on sea level rise, and if we conduct community-oriented workshops, will community members gain knowledge of sea level rise and associated hazards? And I think that the answer to that is yes. And there are many, many other activities that you could do. You could have booths at a community fair. You could have a curriculum in schools or in youth clubs. There are many. You could have a song contest or an essay contest for children. There are many different ways that you can improve awareness and knowledge. You just choose the appropriate ones for your particular location. So then we've got community members acquire skills in resilient construction. Now, how are we going to do this? Well, we're going to build, this is one of my favorites. I've seen this in many projects that I've worked on around the world. We're going to build a demonstration resilience house and a garden, because in Keytopia, household gardens are important. The resilience house is something that we're going to hire an architect to build. And the architect will design a resilience house that is strong for wind, and it's built up on stilts so that it's appropriate for sea level rise, and that it has good air circulation. And we're also going to ask the architect to design it so that it's built from locally available materials, so that people can afford to buy this house. Yeah. And then when we have the house designed, we could even have a contest, an architect's contest, and people could submit designs. But once we have the design, we're going to build this house in the middle of the community so that everybody can see how the house is built. And we'll also have a garden with the house, and this garden will be we'll have climate resilient varieties of fruit, of taro, of other things, right? And it will use maybe drip irrigation. It will be a place where people can come and see climate resilient household gardening techniques. Now, once we have our resilience house and garden built, we're going to have a resilience gardening club for women, so that women can learn how to incorporate these climate smart varieties into their household gardens. Now, this is different from agriculture, because remember, the household gardens are very important for household food consumption. And in household gardens, people tend to grow lots and lots of different types of things. Where it is in fields and farms, they grow fewer things, maybe for some for subsistence and some for the market. But the garden is primarily for household consumption, and it's a diverse garden. Yeah, and it's also very important for building resilience, because in emergency situations, people rely on their household gardens. So we're going to have a resilience gardening club for women. And we're also going to have a carpenter training for community members for the resilient building techniques. So this carpenter training, we're going to teach carpenters how to build the resilient house. And that way they'll be in a position where they can build their own resilient house, but they can provide that service to other people in the community. So it could potentially be livelihood improvement. So they can build the house for people through barter or by being paid to do that. Yeah. Now, normally when you have a carpenter's training, in most cases, that's going to primarily be men that are in the carpenter's training. So that's one of the reasons why we did the resilience garden, because we wanted to make sure that both men and women benefit from this project. So we've got activities for both of them based on what they tend to do in the community, and that would be based on our gender analysis that we conducted in Module 3. So we've got our carpenter training for community building, for community members, for the resilient building techniques. And I've seen these all around the world. They're quite successful. And at the end, once our carpenters complete the training, we're going to give them a toolkit as well, the tools that they need to build the resilient house. And then lastly, we've got community members have resources to support resilient building activities. Resources, money. So here we'll have establish a microcredit loan program for investment in resilient construction and retrofitting, and we'll also establish a revolving savings group, a ROSCIS, for women. Yeah. So this is very important because we want to provide the means for people to adopt these resilience building measures, right? That's extremely important. But from the GCF perspective, the GCF is very interested in stimulating the private sector, as we've talked about in other modules, and they will generally ask you to involve, if you're doing community work, they'll generally ask you to tie the community work to microcredit or microfinance institutions if possible, and to identify a role for private sector capital. And that's what we're doing here. So that's our coastal communities project for Keytopia. Very, very quickly there. And again, this is just a sample representation. So if we were building this project in real life, we would probably have more activities, yeah, and probably another outcome. It would be a more comprehensive project. But you get the idea here. Everything that we're doing in this project is a soft activity. We're not really building anything except for the resilience house. That's the only thing that has a footprint. So this is very likely to be a C category project and eligible for the SAP modality. You can also see the other important lesson here is how our log frame is very, very clearly linked to our theory of change, and that means that the project responds to the actual gaps and barriers and the problems in the community, and because of that, it will very likely bring about lasting change, which is a key element in the project. So that's it for this demonstration. We hope this has been useful, and have a good day. We're signing off.